Hello and welcome back to the Life Without Fear podcast. My name is Dr. Spencer Erickson at Timpview Chiropractic. This is a really interesting one for me today. I've been working on getting this thing done for like a month. Ever since the last one that I put out, I've been working on getting this thing, and it's been really hard to put it together. And I'm not exactly sure why. I actually had this recorded last week, and then it turns out that my recording wasn't very good. And so I'm just redoing the whole thing because I'm more comfortable with the material now. And I think it's really important that all the points get made appropriately and properly. And so what we're going to do today is I'm going to go through this study called Are Continued Efforts to Reduce Radiation Exposure from X-rays Warranted? Now, where this comes from, for years and years, if you talk to somebody about getting X-rays, there's a very high probability that they're going to think about the risk of getting cancer. Do X-rays cause cancer? That's really what this comes down to. And we're going to, as we go through this particular study, it goes through the history and a lot of the misconceptions and a lot of the newer research that's actually come out that talk about X-rays and cancer. So really, that's what we're talking about. Are X-rays harmful in such a way that they will cause your body to become ill, and especially a disease like cancer? Nobody wants cancer. Nobody wants anyone to get cancer. And so we want to be sure that we're being very careful and very safe about everything that we do, but we also want to make sure that we're operating off of the correct assumptions and off of the correct science. Because if we're not operating appropriately based on correct information, then we're going to make poor decisions that will affect us later in life, or they can certainly affect us in different ways. So we're going to kind of jump right into this. The way this is going to work is I'm just going to read verbatim a lot of the paragraphs, a lot of the quotes directly from the article, and then we'll kind of dissect what things mean when it kind of comes down to it. Okay, first. Throughout all healthcare, there are pressures to reduce radiological imaging as well as to reduce the exposures to ionizing radiation used when this type of imaging does occur. Examples of these efforts include the Image Gently for children, Image Wisely for adults, Choosing Wisely, and ACR appropriateness criteria. This results from the indoctrination of radiation fear, or radiophobia, that was spawned since the atomic bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima in 1945. In fact, the majority of lay population are knowledgeable about the link between radiation and cancer, and many would forego medical imaging if it involves radiation, including X-ray and CT scans especially. Now, as far as my experience with this, I have had several people come into my office because I use X-ray. This is one reason this is important for me to talk about, is because I use medical X-ray in my office so that I can diagnose spinal conditions. It's so important to me, so important to my patients to be able to see what's going on and for me to really understand the reason that they're coming in to see me in the first place. Without X-ray, my hands are completely tied. I don't know. Like I can help you out with pain, but I don't know exactly where the problem is necessarily coming from. So we can't get down to the bottom of the condition, which is one thing that I really find is important and one thing that we excel at here at Timpview Chiropractic. So I've had people come in before and I say, all right, we need to take some x-rays so we can see exactly what's going on. And they say, no, I don't want x-rays. I don't want cancer. And that is concerning to me because we need to be sure that we're acting appropriately for the patient's best interest, and to not have unnecessary fear like radiophobia. I remember I had one gal, and I will probably always remember this. She came in and she was just terrified of getting an X-ray. And modern imaging X-rays are so mild anyway that there's just not a lot of exposure regardless, because we're able to control the dose so well, and the modern plates, my digital plate is extra sensitive, like really sensitive, so we don't have to do a lot of X-rays. But she was just terrified of getting an X-ray, and so finally I was like, I have to see what's going on. I need to make sure that you're not injured badly enough that an adjustment is going to actually benefit you. That it's not going to do more harm. And so finally I said, I just need one picture. Just give me one x-ray. She said, fine, we'll do that. So I said, all right, I'll send we'll get that done in a minute. And so I had to step out and do an adjustment. I was going to go back in. And while I was doing that adjustment, she took off. She was just in tears and she couldn't handle it. So we have this kind of misconception. We have this fear that any sort of x-ray exposure is bad for us. And we're going to talk very specifically about that because it's really important to understand what our threshold is and what, how does the body actually respond to low doses versus high doses of x-rays. In 2001, there was a special issue in the American Journal of Radiology that featured several articles highlighting concerns surrounding radiation exposures to pediatric patients from CT imaging. One article in particular, Brenner and others, calculated theoretical future cancer mortality risks from childhood CT exposures. Despite the risk being shown to be small, when extrapolated throughout the pediatric population estimated to receive CT imaging annually, as expected, the number got magnified. The USA Today magazine published an article featuring the projections from Brenner's article, stating each year about 1.6 million children in the USA get a CT scan to the head and abdomen, and about 1,500 of these will die later in life of radiation-induced cancer, according to research out today. Unfortunately, this message instilled fear, but was factually an unproven hypothesis. So we run into this sometimes where we take an extrapolation of a number that's theoretical and it looks way worse than what reality is actually going to look like. So what they're actually saying is every year 1,500 people are going to die just from the radiation exposure they received when they were little kids getting a CT scan. So that's a problem because that's a lot of deaths every single year from something that really needs to occur in the pediatric population to make them live as long as possible. We're not giving CT scans on kids that don't need it, and so these are imaging studies that are kind of important for these kids to receive. And so there are going to be ramifications for publishing data like this, which is completely hypothetical and unproven. Despite the fact that the Brenner article has been criticized for invalid use of the LNT model for low-dose radiation risk assessment, as well as inappropriately extrapolating from the population down to the individual risk level, as the saying goes, the damage was done. 2 months following the USA Today article, a conference was organized to explore the crisis, in quotation marks, of CT imaging and radiation doses in pediatrics. Now I want to talk about this LNT model because they're going to refer to that a lot in here, and we need to understand really well what LNT is. So what is LNT? Linear No Threshold Model. Now, what this basically means is when you have some exposure to radiation, that radiation starts to accumulate, the damage from that radiation rather starts to accumulate inside your body in a linear manner. So let's say that today you go out in the sun and you receive a certain amount of X-ray radiation from the sun, that's just natural during the day, and so that radiation starts to accumulate there, or the damage rather from the radiation starts to accumulate in there. If you go out every single day, then what's happening in the sun, then you're accumulating a certain amount of damage that is occurring. Now, what does no threshold means? It means basically there's no minimum limit for you to start receiving damage. So immediately when you start receiving X-ray damage, in this particular situation it's X-rays, then that damage continues in a linear pattern basically forever. And so you start accumulating damage immediately and it never stops accumulating. In other words, that's what LNT means. There's no threshold for when damage actually begins. And it accrues, or the damage accrues, in a linear form. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, as we go through this, we're going to look at opposing models, which are going to be very important. Now, this conference led to the medical profession to adopt ALARA, or ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable as a radiation protection principle. The first ALARA conference led to subsequent conferences and involved scientists, physicians, technologists, manufacturers, and representatives from governmental agencies. Soon followed the creation of radiation reduction/avoidance campaigns, including Image Gently for Children in 2006 and Image Wisely for adults in 2007. Now, I don't know if you are aware of these reduced radiation campaigns. I certainly am in my profession. The problem with it is that they're saying, all right, chiropractors, quit x-raying so many people. Well, the problem with that is, and same thing with medical doctors. Medical doctors are also being asked to x-ray less. The problem with that is that x-ray is an extremely inexpensive and an extremely effective way to diagnose things in patients, especially relative to the spine and even other tissues around the spine. So we need to be able to x-ray to a certain extent. I x-ray a large percentage of my patients because that's how I help them the very most. And so we need to find out, okay, is this LNT, this linear no threshold model, the most appropriate way to go off of? Because that's where they're basing all of their recommendations on. The Brenner article was soon followed by the National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements, NCRP Report 160, back in 2006, that showed the near doubling of public exposures to medical radiation, mostly due to CT scans. This is when CT scans were getting much, much better than they were before. Subsequently, more recent long-term studies of children cohorts who had received CT scans that showed increased cancers in adulthood emerged. Okay, so there's a little bit to unpack here. There's a lot of words in that. So in 2006, this report 160 came out, said basically we're doubling the exposure or near doubling the exposure of patients, people in general, to x-rays, mostly because of CT scans. CT scans, prior to this were not really, especially back in the 90s, they were like really low resolution, and you could tell that you could see big things but not little things. But as as CT technology improved, then the resolution has improved, and it was being used much more frequently. Okay, just the very next sentence. These articles have been heavily criticized for suffering from reverse causation, or how children who require CT scans in childhood are more likely or already predisposed to get more cancers than healthier children who do not get imaged. Indeed, this criticism was confirmed in the study by Journey and others, who showed that while initially there was a significant correlation, after controlling for known cancer predisposing risk factors, no significant association was found in assessing cancer risk in adults who received CT scans prior to the age of 10. Now, this is a very important sentence because what's happening is they're imaging kids who are already at risk of getting cancer. That's why they're studying those kids. They're doing CTs on these kids who already have an increased cancer risk. And so just because they get cancer later, it doesn't mean that it was caused by the CT scan. That's what they're using the CT scan for, was detect a higher risk of cancer in the first place. And so they're coming out with these articles saying CT's causing these cancers in kids. But they're finding out, no, just by doing a little bit more research and removing some of the confounding factors, they're saying, no, actually, especially in under 10 years old, it makes no difference at all. It's not increasing the risk of cancers in these kids. Simultaneously, over the last 20 years, the media has very successfully amplified the message of cancers being linked to essential radiological imaging. Cohen, for example, has presented a table featuring headlines and quotes from mainstream media outlets suggesting CT scans are associated with cancers. The media's fear-mongering messaging to the public is so successful that many now fear medically warranted X-rays and CT scans. In fact, that is now a common and challenging issue among doctors attempting to deliver efficient healthcare to patients who require X-ray. Now you can see on here, there are references that you are welcome to look up this article and start looking at these references. If this is something that interests you, or if you're like, I don't know about this stuff, well then do your research on it and actually read all of the information that's there for you. We have lots of information now at our disposal. If we continue to make decisions based off of insufficient data, then we're going to continue to get the outcomes which we're getting, they're not good outcomes. We don't have greatly reduced risk of cancers now that we know so much about health and vitality in the human body. We have to take that research, which is appropriate and which is done appropriately, and we can incorporate all of this information into our lives and act individually according to that, and not just, as one terrified mass of people. The main problem with these campaigns is there is no evidence that low-dose radiation as given by X-rays and CT scans induce cancers. In fact, there is evidence to the contrary. Low-dose radiation exposures lowers cancer incidence and extends cancer latency period. Now this is really the interesting part, because what we're actually finding is that if you have small doses of X-rays, as in CT scans and medical imaging, medical X-ray imaging, it actually can decrease your risk of cancer. Didn't think of that. And I never thought of that either. How interesting is that assertion? And so we're going to talk about exactly why that's that principle, or exactly what that principle is and why it's in place for us. I think it's really, really interesting, and what a huge blessing for us. The studies that have claimed that cancers are caused by radiological imaging are either theoretical LNT-based projections, which are falsehood, or studies that have follow up with cohorts who were imaged in their childhood that suffer from reverse causation. That's what we just talked about in one of the last slides. Because healthy children do not need CT scans. In fact, Shibata and others state that because they determine children who require CT scans had 13 times the rate of congenital anomalies, the population of children undergoing CT is completely different from that not undergoing CT. The two groups should not be compared. So, a 13 times difference in children who need CT scans they're 13 times greater to have congenital, 13 times greater risk of having congenital anomalies than kids who don't need CT scans. So those two populations should not be studied together. They should be completely separated from each other. We're not doing CT scans on healthy kids. And so saying that, all these CT scans are causing 1,500 people dying per year is just a complete falsehood, because they already have such a high risk of getting cancer anyway. The historic evidence that has always been touted as the main source or proof that radiation causes cancer is the lifespan study data, or LSS data. In 2012, however, Ozasa and others reported an update that upon correction for background cancer incidence by DOS, clearly shows a nonlinear or quadratic dose response curve that is hormesis. So first, let's talk about this LSS data, the lifespan study data. The place that comes from is here. All right, and this book is available. This is just Google Books, and you can look it up, Health Risks from Exposure to Low Levels of Ionizing Radiation. So this is old data that they've been using to make a lot of assumptions and assertions on. But as is described here, in 2012, a dissection of the studies and the information reported an update that upon correction for background cancer incidence, clearly shows a nonlinear or quadratic dose response curve. That's hormesis. So now we got to talk about something called hormesis. Okay, so this is the National Institutes of Health website. Now if we screw, this is hormesis defined. And basically, hormesis is a term used by toxicologists to refer to a biphasic dose response to an environmental agent characterized by a low dose stimulation or beneficial effect and a high dose inhibitory or toxic effect. In the fields of biology and medicine, hormesis is defined as an adaptive response of cells and organisms to a moderate or usually intermittent stress. Now, we're going to switch back. Okay, so this is an example of hormesis when we're talking about radiation. Now, what it's talking about, biphasic response, that means there are two responses that the body has. If you have a low dose of radiation, in particular, we're talking about radiation here, specifically X-rays. If you have a low dose of that, then what it does is it has a stimulatory or beneficial effect on the body. But if you have a really high dose, then it actually has a toxic or non-beneficial effect on the body. Now, how does that work? Well, what happens when you have, let's say we're talking about X-rays still, if I do an X-ray of a patient, that's called ionizing radiation. It pushes through tissues. That's why we can see right through, water-based tissues and fat-based tissues, but we don't see really well through bone-based tissues, because they're high-energy photons and they push right through most tissues. What they do after that is they strike the plate, and that creates this two-dimensional image, just like a photograph, in a lot of ways. So it's pushing through. Now, when it pushes through the tissues, it's striking the cells, and it's going into the cell membranes, and it's going through the nucleus of the cells, and it's going through the DNA. What the LNT model, or the linear non-threshold model, tells us is when you have that damage inside any cell or any DNA in the chromosomes, in the nucleus of the cells, then that damage continues to accumulate. What actually happens, though, when you get a little bit of damage to the DNA, the cell has restorative mechanisms that kick in, and they actually will start to repair the DNA immediately. Now, were those actions stimulated prior to this? No. So they were latent. They were not doing anything before. You push X-rays into the body, and the body says, "Oh man, we got a little problem here," and so it kicks on those reparative mechanisms, and so it immediately starts repairing any damage to the DNA and damage to the cells. Now, as we're going through life, and as things are happening anyway, there's going to be just minor things that happen to DNA and happen to cell membranes and that kind of stuff. And that stuff will actually start accumulating really slowly over time. If no reparative mechanism ever gets kicked on, then it's just going to continue to be in there, and that cell will just remain damaged. But if we do a little bit of X-ray, boom, we push it right through there, and it kicks on the reparative mechanisms, well, then it's going to take care of the new damage that happened with that, which, yes, admittedly, is damage in the cell. But it's going to repair that, and it's also going to repair any other incidental damage that's been occurring over the years anyway. So it's very beneficial for the cells. Now, what if we do a big, huge huge dose of radiation, like a nuclear plant meltdown or an atomic bomb or something like that, and you're really close to it, you get a ton of radiation. Well, that's really damaging, and the body cannot repair those on the same scale that it can minor damages. So we're going to look at this graph here. You can see there's a line here. Now, what they did, this is the newer research. They actually made they corrected for the incidence of cancer risk, and they actually pulled that way down because of the correction they were able to do mathematically. So what this actually shows is that if you have small doses of radiation, this is your risk of cancer right here. And so if you just have a baseline everyday risk, no radiation exposure whatsoever, this is kind of the average risk of getting cancer. If you have a little bit of radiation exposure, what it does is it actually pushes the cancer risk down because of those reparative mechanisms inside the cell. Cancer basically is a condition where the DNA is so badly damaged that some gene gets switched on, or the production of some enzyme or protein gets switched on, and it kind of starts running rampant and out of control. And that happens a lot of time from DNA damage or other damage inside a cell. So if we do that, the little hormesis that we've been talking about, where protective and reparative mechanisms start getting kicked on, well, then what the effect of that is that we're going to see a decreased risk of cancer to a certain point. Okay, now this is the dosage right here of radiation, and this is the risk of cancer. And so it stays down, down until we get to this point right here, which I believe is about 700 milligray. That's this GY. That stands for gray, and that's how they kind of measure dosage. So yeah, sure enough, down here, 0.7 gray or 700 milligray, that's the threshold at which, when you get past that in a particular dose, then the cancer risk starts to rise. We start to see that non-linear. Okay, so instead of a linear, no threshold, this is non-linear. See how it's kind of bouncing up and down here? It actually swoops down, and then it's going to swoop up when you get to a certain level, and they're saying right now the level is 700 milligray. So how much exposure actually is there in a CT scan or in a medical x-ray? Well, that's what we're going to talk about right now. Okay, I'm going to try not to lose you on this. It gets confusing, and I apologize for this, but it is important. Now, if we come to this website here, we talk about the MS and versus the milligray. So the milligray, that's what we were just talking about. 700 milligray is the threshold that we were just talking about. In the SI system, so milliesievert. So basically, that's it's accumulated radiation dose. So they're still measuring it. So this is inappropriate at this point to be doing this, but they're still doing this. Okay, 1 MSV is the dose produced, I'll just highlight it here, by exposure to 1 milligray of radiation. So we're going to call it an equivalency. 1 millisievert is basically equivalent to 1 milligray. All right, now we were just talking about how 700 milligray is the threshold at which we need to start getting worried about cancer. Okay, anything under that, it's actually beneficial. All right, that's what the hormetic effect is through hormesis. Okay, now we're on radiationinfo.org, and what they're doing here, they are promoting this stuff that we're talking about, this LNT, linear non-threshold model. And so what they do is they talk about this, the millisieverts. Okay, now the approximate effective radiation dose for a CT of the abdomen and pelvis is 7.7 millisieverts. All right, now if we remember, that's about 7.7 milligrays, which is 1/100th of the threshold dose needed to start being worried about cancer. So we're talking about 2 orders of magnitude. It's not only 10 times less, it's 100 times less than what we really need to be worried about. And that's a whole CT scan. This is a CT of the abdomen and pelvis, repeated with and without contrast. So this is four total CT studies. You get 15.4 millisieverts. So we're talking way less, way less than anything we really even need to be worried about. For a lumbar spine x-ray, 1 milligray, 1.4 millisieverts. Extremity, less than 0.001 millisieverts. So we're talking for this, it's almost 1,000 times less dangerous than what they're actually telling you that it's going to be, because we're so far under that 700 milligray or millisievert threshold because we're calling those an equivalency here, because it's dose versus exposure. 700 is really, that's according to the one study. Now we're actually going to refer to another study in a minute. So you can see on here that getting x-rays is not a big dose. Even a CT scan, which is many x-rays, is not a significant dose for the body to contend with. Okay, so where do those millisieverts fall on here? Well, we're talking like here. Way over here. And so we get a little dose of that, and guess what cancer risk does? It drops way, way down. And so if we actually look at the applied, well-studied, well-thought-out data, that data shows us that the small amount of x-rays that we receive in medical offices and CT imaging centers, they're actually beneficial in a lot of ways at reducing cancers. Now, that's what this is studying. This is not a claim that I'm making out of the blue. This is not some I'm a chiropractor and chiropractic gets rid of cancer thing. This is taking everything into consideration that is real in the research. And that's really what we should be looking at, not just basing everything off of fear like these other websites are doing. All right, this one's really, really interesting. So this is a UN study data that was performed secretly back in 1958. It's basically a council of scientists that the UN put together to study the effects of Nagasaki and Hiroshima on the population that was exposed. So this is really interesting, and I think this is so valuable. So this is the 1958 data when they actually look at cancer risk over time. Now here's our threshold, or this is baseline cancer risk. All right. So this is you and me. If we weren't exposed to any radiation whatsoever, no Nagasaki, no Hiroshima, no X-rays, no nothing, this is our normal cancer risk. Okay, if we start to get X-rayed at a low level, then what happens is this goes down and down. So this is hormesis again. This is just another graphic showing the exact same thing using different data points. So it gets lower and lower until we reach this right here. And then the benefit decreases, but we're still being benefited all the way to here. This is the lower cancer risk, even at this. So what this is showing is actually up to 1,200 milligrays. The last study, they were actually showing the beneficial effect actually stopped at 700 milligrays. So right about here. All right, so that's close to this line. But this study actually shows it's 1,200 milligrays. And so this is actually showing a beneficial effect on exposed patients, people who are being exposed to x-rays up to 1,200 milligray. Now that is 1,000 times more than an x-ray, 1,000 times. So we're talking about 2 to 3 orders of magnitude, which that's what they're going to talk about in this study here again. So I think this is so important, and it's so helpful to understand this and feel empowered about your health rather than everybody just trying to scare you all the time about every little thing. The body is amazing. It's remarkable. It has protective mechanisms in place to take care of itself. You know, if we were a population that just spent all day out in the sun every day, guess what? Those people are getting a lot of X-ray exposure from the sun, as well as UV exposure and all that kind of stuff. Those people are not all condemned to die, you know, of cancer just because they're out in the sun all day receiving X-rays all day. It's not that linear, non-threshold dose. And so it's just one of those things saying, all right, the body's intelligent. It has places, or it has mechanisms put in place to protect us from this stuff. We don't have to be afraid of everything. Please don't be afraid of everything. The body's smart. If we keep ourselves clean and we keep ourselves, you know, eating well and doing good things for it and exercising, doing good stuff, the body will generally take care of us. Okay, back to the study. Decades of radiobiological research on animals and humans show that on a molecular, cellular, and whole body levels, there are effects that occur that are not consistent with LNT ideology. In fact, there are many adaptive defense mechanisms that get initiated and or upregulated upon low-dose radiation stimulation, such as DNA repair systems, programmed cell death, cell cycle delay, cellular senescence, adaptive memory, bystander effects, which is exposed cells communicate to non-exposed cells, epigenetics, immune stimulation, and tumor suppression. That is a lot of beneficial things that just switch on. When the body gets exposed to bad stuff, it starts taking care of itself. These innate adaptive responses are very efficient and effective. This is how low-dose irradiation therapy works. So they actually have something called low-dose radiation therapy or irradiation therapy, where you actually expose somebody to low doses of radiation. Okay, so this is in dose response. It's called the linear no threshold model versus radiation hormesis. That's kind of what this whole thing is about. Now, as we go through this, this is going to say a lot of what we've been talking about in other in the other article. So I'll go through some of this. The atomic bomb survivor cancer mortality data have been used in the past to justify the use of the linear no threshold or LNT model for estimating the carcinogenic effect of low dose radiation, or cancer causing effect. That's what carcinogenic means. An analysis of the recently updated atomic bomb survivor cancer mortality dose response data shows that the data no longer supports the LNT model, but are consistent with radiation hormesis model when a correction is applied for a likely bias in the baseline cancer mortality rate. So in other words, when you take the same data that was used to create the LNT model and you correct for the appropriate parameters, it actually does show that it's a hormetic effect, just like we've been talking about. That's what the last two graphs have been talking about, or that exact thing. If the validity of the phenomenon of radiation hormesis is confirmed in prospective human pilot studies and is applied to the wider population, it could result in a considerable reduction in cancers. The idea of using radiation hormesis to prevent cancers was proposed more than 3 decades ago, but was never investigated in humans to determine its validity because of the dominance of the LNT model and the consequent carcinogenic concerns regarding low-dose radiation. They were just afraid to study it because the LNT model has been so predominant. That's what I learned in school. That's what they taught me in school, is the LNT model. Since cancer continues to be a major health problem and the age-adjusted cancer mortality rates have declined by only about 10% in the past 45 years, it may be prudent to investigate radiation hormesis as an alternative approach to reduce cancers. Prompt action is urged. So, where did this come from? This is in dose response. So this is a radiation-based scientific journal. It's a peer-reviewed journal. It's very well respected. And what they're saying is prompt action is urged. So what we run into is the problem of whether our researchers and whether our scientific community is willing to look at something preventative for cancer, or if they only want to do treatment once the cancer is already taken a hold. And I have my personal opinions on this. I'm sure you have your personal opinions on this too, if you're watching this. We need to invest. We need to be willing to invest in preventative measures. Chiropractic is very preventative. That's why I like doing what I do. People come in, yes, they're hurting, and yes, I find stuff that's already happening, but if we can stop it where it is, we can prevent it from actually causing problems down the road. That's really what it's all about. That's why I do what I do. And that's why I love what I do so much, because it is preventative. It helps people immediately, and it helps people for long term if applied appropriately. So we have to be willing to make those jumps. Now, we're getting off on a tangent here, so we're going to move back to the main article. Okay, the most current radiobiological data shows low-dose radiation exposures decrease cancers, and the most current LSS analyses show high thresholds for harm. We're talking 700 to 1200 milligray, right? That, according to those charts. And invalidates the LNT for use in risk assessment from low exposures as from x-rays and CT scans. So LNT is no longer effective in that. So if it's a dose concern that you're worried about, first of all, we don't need to be worried about doses with these things, because they're literally, 100th to 1000th the dose required that we even need to start being worried about a cancer risk. I would need to be doing 3 to 5, well, let's say 300 studies, 300 x-ray studies per year. That's one almost every single day of the year to get to the point where we even start to need to be worried about an increased cancer risk. That's really when it takes it back to baseline, because if we do 100, that actually is still is considered beneficial to the body because of the hormetic response of the body. Okay, and we're kind of coming to the end of this article now, and hopefully I've been able to present things in such a way that's been understandable and makes sense, and is convincing, because we need to give the body credit. We need to allow the body's immune system and other mechanisms, reparative mechanisms, to work the way they were designed. We're very well designed. Your whole body built itself out of 2 cells. All of this complexity came to be, it put itself together, and it put itself together so that it can win, so that it can succeed, not fail. And so if we're eating clean and we're doing, and of course bad things happen to good people in good situations. And yes, genetics does have an influence. And there's a lot that we need to consider. But we also need to, stand back in awe of what the human body and the human frame really is capable of, and what it's done, and what it is. and just give it credit for what it is. Now, as we're wrapping this up here, we're going to read just a couple more things and then we'll be all done. Once the best evidence that was used to support LNT ideology, the lifespan study data, that's that LSS that we talked about way long ago, now indicates that thresholds for cancer induction are quite high and that exposures to low-dose X-rays do not cause harm. Current practices are safe, as exposures currently encountered are on orders of magnitude below threshold levels that have been shown to be harmful. 2 to 3 orders of magnitude, that's hundreds to thousands. We have shown efforts to reduce exposures that are within background radiation levels that are also shown to enhance health by upregulating natural adaptive protection systems are definitively wasted resources. Now I'm going to go back to that last sentence. Upregulating natural adaptive protection systems are definitively wasted resources. That's what that other article was talking about. We can be studying this and seeing how we can actually prevent some of the problems that people are saying that X-rays are causing. In the modern evidence-based era, these fruitless radiation reduction efforts need to stop, as they are neither evidence-based nor effective, but do constrain practice and cause harm. Well, constraining practice is not a good idea because we're in the business of helping people, hopefully. And I know that there are a lot of situations where we feel like, yeah, my doc's not really, he's just in it for the money or whatever, or the hospital system, and that you know, maybe something to that. But those of us who are in it for patient health, we just want to be able to do the job that we were asked to do the most effective way that we can. Now, as we're finding out some of this really cool stuff like hormesis and like these adaptive protective mechanisms inside the body, I think it's amazing, and we can start incorporating that stuff. But a lot of times, you know, where's the money? A lot of times the money is found in treatment, not in prevention. And so that's a lot of times just where this stuff's just not going to get researched the way that it should. And so they're going to fall behind the curve because they're okay doing that because they're still making billions and billions and billions of dollars in treatment. And so, you know, that's not just an opinion, that's just kind of the way the medical system works. And so that's going to bring us to the end of this. I love this. I really love that this article was put together so that I could go through it and share it with you. All right. Thank you for watching this. If you have any questions on this, please feel free to contact me. My name is Dr. Spencer Erickson. My email address is drspencererickson@gmail.com. You can reach the front desk at TimFew Chiropractic at 801-762-6940. You can text us because that's a cell phone now. You can just send a text and say, hey, I want more information. What are your, I want to get scheduled, or I need to talk to Dr. Erickson or whatever. Email me. The front desk email is timviewreception@gmail.com. We have lots of ways. You can find us on facebook.com/TimFewChiropractic. You found this video somehow, so there are lots of ways to reach us. Anyway, if you have any questions, please let me know. I hope you have an amazing day and a great rest of your week, and we will look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thanks for watching.